I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm running the game under HDR, high dynamic range. This monitor will respond to HDR10 content in a very dynamic way. It has VISA Display HDR 1400 or 1400 certification. That is the highest level which VISA will certify for LCDs. And this allows it to pump out very high brightness. So the brightness here, it's very strong. It's not, and this isn't even the peak luminance that the monitor will output, by the way, because the sun isn't streaming in, it's just sort of passively illuminated daylight, if you like. And it can also give really nice depth to darker shades simultaneously. So it's putting that Mini LED backlight solution to really good work. It's an FALD, full array local dimming solution, which I described earlier with local dimming. If you're just watching this section of the video review, then just to reiterate that it is very reactive, the solution, so it doesn't feel laggy. There isn't sort of a trail of halos around the place as you shift between darker and brighter content, that kind of thing. There are, however, some significant pixel responsiveness limitations to be aware of, which can actually become more apparent under HDR, and again, they're explored in the responsiveness section. I've got the monitor hooked up to an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, and it is hooked up via HDMI 2.1. As usual, because I like to be very thorough, I did test this monitor with an AMD GPU. I tested with HDMI and DisplayPort on my AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, and this monitor has some interesting inconsistencies to be aware of depending on the port that you're using, and also some inconsistencies depending on the GPU you're using. And if you're using a games console, you're going to be basically using the HDMI AMD graphics hardware route. Now the good news is that via HDMI, this really gives the best look to the image under HDR with the most appropriate depth, that kind of thing. But when I was using DisplayPort, for some reason things look quite washed out in general, as if there was a sort of uplift of gamma, as if you were viewing things under SDR with a gamma of, say, 1.8 instead of 2.2. So it really gives quite a foggy, flooded look. That doesn't occur using HDMI. Another little bit of an intricacy to be aware of on the AMD side. So HDMI, by the way, fine, AMD and NVIDIA side, and would be on games consoles as well. DisplayPort, a bit funky. The other thing is the FreeSync Premium Pro setting. So I just adjusted my camera exposure so you can see the menu. In display, there's FreeSync Premium Pro. This is an adaptive sync toggle. On my NVIDIA GPU, whether you've got this enabled or disabled, it doesn't change what it's doing under HDR. That's fine. With my AMD GPU, with this enabled, it did change things. It gave a bit more of a contrasty look. I found that it actually crushed some highlights together a bit too much as well. So I didn't like this look so much. Some people might, but I prefer the look with FreeSync Premium Pro disabled and therefore adaptive sync disabled. Anyway, let's put some numbers to everything. So this somewhat busy looking graph shows the monitor with various different white patch sizes or percentage of pixels. So what this means is that there's a box in the middle of the screen and it is showing 1% of the pixels of the monitor as white, and it is surrounded by pure black, or it's showing 4%, 9%, 25%, 49%, or 100%. Of course, with 100%, the entire screen is white. There is no black being displayed at all. And this just gives you an idea of how the local dimming solution performs in terms of its brightness. So I'm showing you the different levels which I discussed under SDR. So remember that level 1 or lower levels, they will dark bias more. High levels will bright bias more. But as you can see in general, they're quite close to one another. And certainly if you compare to the orange line, which shows the Dell Alienware AW3423DW using its peak HDR 1000 mode. So that's a QD OLED monitor, which I've thrown in here for comparison. You'll see that there's obvious differences there, whereas if you compare the levels, there aren't huge differences. For the 1% patch, that's really where you see some differences, and the numbers there are just shown for level 1 and level 4 with the local dimming, just to keep things a little bit neater. But you'll see for the 1% patch, the first blobs there on the graph, the higher levels do give you a bit of extra brightness, and really where you'll notice the differences between these settings more readily is for particularly small bright content, and you will get that when you're actually using the monitor and gaming or watching HDR movie content. And just to add at this point, I did look at a lot of HDR movie content or video content on Netflix. I actually really enjoyed it overall for that kind of thing. But as with games, you know, some content makes better use of HDR than others. But it's really for those very small white elements below 1% of pixels where you'll see perhaps more distinct differences with the levels. But again, I prefer level 3. That's just my preference. You'll have your own preferences, and I could arguably say that I'd prefer different levels for different content, but I don't want to overcomplicate things, and you don't want to always be changing the level depending on the content, so I just settled with level 3. You'll then see a bump up in luminance to 4% of pixels, and a further bump up to 9%, reaching a peak of 1422 nits, so that is within the specification for VESA Display HDR 1400 or 1400, slightly exceeds it, but not massively. So that is very bright. And you'll also notice that it drops a bit for larger white patches, and that's normal for it to not be able to sustain its full brightness when there is a lot of white or a lot of bright content on the screen. But if you compare that to the drop that you get comparing 1% to, or perhaps 4% to 9% and then down to 25% with the QD OLED monitor, you'll see that the ViewSonic here sustains really good brightness even for a lot of bright content on the screen. Another thing to be aware of for HDR10 content is the monitor can use 10-bit color processing, which enhances the nuanced shade variety. So when you look at closely matching dark shades, good examples of that here, there's this natural uplift of detail, which you don't get under SDR. If you enhance the gamma to try and lift out the detail, it doesn't give you a greater variety of shades, it just lifts things up too much so that shades are brighter than they should be. Whereas here, you get a really nice mixture of these dark shades, which just gives a nice natural look to things. But because there are 1152 dimming zones and 5 million pixels on the monitor, you don't get the kind of level of precision you'd need to, you know, make these really dark cracks in the rock and the shadow details super deep and super dark, because it's bordering content with medium or brighter shades, so it has to make a compromise. So it doesn't give you the kind of OLED level precision. You can also see a bit of a halo around the crosshair with the very dark content around it. And I'm just going to quickly jump onto a different scene. This one will be very familiar to you if you have watched the contrast section of the video. Now, the level of precision under HDR, the tone mapping precision, is much better than under SDR, and the look is very different here. So it's basically gone for extreme darkness, so that the monitor can respond to metadata very accurately under HDR, and the tone mapping precision is enhanced in such a way that it knows that this is supposed to be deep and atmospheric, so it is. Whereas under SDR, it kind of just had a sort of flooded looking mixture of medium shades. That does mean that you don't get the same kind of detail brought out here. That would require superior dimming precision. If the monitor was trying to do that and trying to lift out the details here, then that would come at the expense of the depth and atmosphere. But here, really, really good in that respect. Really good depth and atmosphere. You can still see a bit of a glow there, so the dimming zones there have brightened up more. That's towards the left side of the screen. And certainly in the middle, there is a bit more brightness. And particularly if I draw my bow, there's a lot of brightness there. And you can also see a halo fairly clearly in this particular example. It's a bit of a stress test for this kind of thing, actually, this scene. You can see it quite clearly around my HUD elements there. I don't know how this will come across on the video, but to my eye, even if I'm sitting in a better lit room than I am at the moment, I can see the halo there. And you will come across these halos from time to time. As I mentioned, you can lower the local dimming setting, which will mean they're less likely to form for smaller bright elements, but for big bright elements or relatively large bright elements surrounded by darkness, you're still going to get this issue. And it doesn't have to be darkness, it could be medium shades as well, as I showed you with the local dimming solution under SDR. So it isn't perfect when you have a far greater number of pixels than you do dimming zones, but there is still a good number of dimming zones, and the fact that this is a VA panel with natively strong contrast, it does help minimize those halos. And really the overall look to scenes like this is very good. To really just emphasize again, the brightness there, really impressive. You'll just be able to see this kind of big bright ball of light on the video. To the eye, it doesn't appear overexposed in the same way, but it definitely appears nice and bright. Back to the other scene quickly, and I will jump between different scenes and even different games in this section. Can be a little bit disorienting, I know, but it does help me give different examples, different subjective impressions. The glint of light on the water surface there, very bright, very eye-catching indeed. The light streaming up there, really nice look to that as well. The 10-bit precision gives a really nice nuanced shade variety here, which gives you gentler gradients. Just going to temporarily adjust the camera so you can sort of see that it's not just a giant ball of light. Of course, you won't be able to see what you see to the eye, but to the eye you do see nice gentle progressions of these bright shades. It can give weather effects and that kind of thing a more natural look. And that does depend on the game as well, and the particular content, because the game developers do have to implement it in an appropriate way. But in most modern game titles, I do find that there are certainly some elements which really do show this off nicely, and this would be an example. The monitor can be displaying really nice brightness there, whereas there, much better depth, nice depth to the medium shades there, also toned down nicely, the darker shades, much better than when you're using local dimming or high brightness under SDR, where the medium shades are just lifted up far too much, so the precision here is much better under HDR. It's good to see. Yes, if it had per pixel illumination or a much greater number of dimming zones, you'd be able to have the little shadow details in the vegetation even deeper, but I think it does pretty well, to be honest. The overall representation here is nice. Just whilst I load up Battlefield 5, and again it's running under HDR, yep, you'll be able to see a little bit of haloing there around the bright text with the pure black in the background, unsurprisingly. But this scene is one that I have used on a few different monitors, and I've used this game more generally on quite a few monitors when I test HDR. It has a really nice HDR implementation. I know it's not the newest game, but it is new enough that the HDR implementation is really good, and they certainly took some care over it. So I like to use it, and the monitor just really does very nicely for this scene. I've also just remembered that the monitor does have a few different HDR settings. I would just recommend sticking to the display HDR setting. There's also something called cinematic HDR and something called gameplay HDR. As I mentioned in the written review, they had no effect, at least on my NVIDIA GPU. They were exactly the same, so I wouldn't really bother using them. You do get a little bit more flexibility if you use the gameplay or cinematic HDR settings and you happen to have local dimming disabled. But if you have local dimming disabled, then the monitor basically is at 500 nits all the time, and you're not using the local dimming, which is an incredible waste of this monitor, so I have no idea why you'd want to do that. But I would just recommend using display HDR or one of the other settings, assuming they are the same on your unit as each other. Otherwise, the display HDR setting, and just leave everything default. You can't really change many things. I'll just quickly show you that. So the HDR settings, a lot's grayed out. Can't use pure XP, that's a strobe backlight setting. Of course, you can't ever use that kind of thing with HDR, doesn't make sense. You can adjust the response time OD, so that's the response time setting, but you can't adjust the blue light filter, color temperature settings, color adjust, so that means you can't adjust gamma or the color channels, and you can't adjust contrast, brightness, sharpness, or advanced DCR, which is this silly dynamic contrast setting. Again, don't bother using it. You've got a proper mini LED backlight here. So anyway, back to this scene. The sun there is beautifully bright, really nice brightness there. And the clouds as well have this nice sort of natural glow to them, and the sky in general has a certain luminosity. Lovely word. And it's all maintained regardless of how much of the scene you're looking at the same time. If you recall the graph I showed you earlier, that's because the monitor is able to sustain really good brightness even when there are a lot of bright shades are being displayed on the screen at once. So that's very different to the OLED monitors I've tested, whereby scenes like this will cause the ABL, automatic brightness limiter, to kick in rather heavily. It's a power control issue, really. And that just means that this scene doesn't have these kind of bright highlights. It doesn't have the natural look to the daylight that you get here. So certainly for this kind of scene, bright daylight scene, or where there are just lots of bright elements, I really like how this monitor represents things. And because of the local dimming, it's not just flooding everything. There are a lot of different brightness levels throughout this scene, and includes some rather dark looking rocks here. And yes, again, I was going to say per pixel illumination could enhance the precision. I think you get it by this point, but what would give you that? Well, an OLED would, but then it would also be dimming more for the very bright shades. So When people just say OLEDs are fantastic for HDR and leave it there, I don't really think that's a fair representation of things, because they do have some relative weaknesses, at least current OLED monitors and QD OLED monitors, compared to this particular experience. And whilst this isn't quite as bright as the Asus PG32UQX, which was super impressive on this scene, even if you were sitting in quite a bright room, it is still impressive. And it does come much closer to that than any OLED monitor I've tested again, so I do like its representation in this scene. And even if I am sitting in a brighter room, because I don't always use HDR in a dark room, and actually I find it more comfortable to sit in a brighter room and use HDR, even for scenes like this, it's still enjoyable in a brighter room. I'm on a different scene, on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again using HDR, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction, because that's another important aspect of HDR, sometimes overlooked by people, but it is something which I'm quite particular about. And it certainly has a vibrant look. Under HDR, the developers can target wider colour gamuts, so DCI-P3 and indeed Rec 2020, which is a much wider gamut, which this monitor does not fully cover or come close to fully covering. But at least having good DCI-P3 coverage is a good sort of start for HDR, and this one does tick that box. Yes, there are some losses of saturation, again, just like under SDR, towards the bottom of the screen and edges because of the gamma shifts and the slight inconsistencies with the colours there, but even with that in mind, overall look definitely on the vibrant side. ViewSonic has actually mapped things in a way where there is still some oversaturation, but there's less oversaturation than under SDR, where the sRGB gamut is the target, because now they're targeting the wider gamuts. That does mean that things are toned down, but ViewSonic's mapping kind of works against that a bit. So there are some kind of overly bright and overly yellowish greens, and some of the greens don't look as deep and lush as they could, and that's not just because of the way that ViewSonic's mapped things, it's also because of the fact that the colour gamut doesn't extend as much in the green region as it could. Fine for DCI-P3, but if you compare to Rec 2020, then there is quite a bit of coverage missing in the green region, but that doesn't mean that things look washed out, please don't get me wrong, it definitely isn't the case here. And if you think about the red region of the gamut here, a lot of extension there. In fact, I'll just flash the gamut up again briefly, just so if you're just watching this section of the video, you have a bit of a reference. So that certainly gives a lot of pop to red shades, but it is toned down compared to SDR. So the fires here are a good example of that. There's a nice combination of really nice vibrant looking oranges, reds and yellows. Under SDR, the oranges are brought out more strongly than this, and they verge on red. Here there is a bit of extra sort of reddening to the orange a little bit, but not as much as under SDR. And I'm sorry that on the video this just looks like a giant ball of white. It's because it's also very bright as well as being highly saturated. That's just the camera. And just the red shades in general, a little bit overdone. Laura's skin as well, overdone again, but not as much as under SDR, where she can look sunburnt or suntanned, and skin tones in general just tend to look richer than they should. There's not as much of that going on, just a little bit of extra richness. So I don't really have too much more to say about HDR on this monitor. I think I really did enjoy the Mini LED backlight solution. I think it's well implemented. In terms of the contrast, really nice. Yes, sure, per pixel illumination would have been nice, but you can't have everything at the moment. On the colour side, certainly vibrant. Some inconsistencies due to the panel type and also the way that ViewSonic has mapped things. Personally would have preferred things to be a little bit toned down, a bit more natural, but I think most people are going to be pretty happy with the colour output under HDR on this monitor, even if they find SDR a little bit overbearing in that respect.